Kevin Hollinrake is with me this morning, Shadow Secretary of State for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. What did you make of what the Chancellor had to say?
Good morning. Listen, I welcome any growth in the economy because that's not what we've seen over the previous months since they took over. When Rachel Reeves took over this economy, it was the fastest growing in the G7, as your correspondent just said. Now it is the slowest growing economy in the G7. Rachel Reeves seems to think she could grow the economy. She doesn't grow the economy. Regulators don't grow the economy. Businesses grow the economy. And what Rachel Reeves has done since taking over is 6 months of gloom and doom about the economy, which was nonsense, and then hit business with £25 billion a year tax rises and more regulation, the Employment Rights Bill, which will really put huge burdens on businesses. So, of course, we all want growth. We welcome any growth. But Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer are going about it in completely the wrong way.
Talk to me about the Renters Reform Bill. I was reading in my copy of The Independent that you hold shares in a company which opposed the Renters Reform Bill. Is that right?
No, it isn't actually. I sold those shares before the budget because I knew it would be a disastrous budget. But I've never, ever sought to, although I was in business before politics, and I've made that very clear, and all that is declared, of course, I've never sought to look after my own interests in being in government. I've tried to look after the interests of consumers, which includes tenants. The Renters' Rights Bill will really be very damaging for tenants because it'll reduce supply into the market and drive up rents. And that's what we've seen in Scotland, where we've done exactly the same measures. And now what we're seeing in Scotland, not only can landlords not ask tenants to leave at the end of a contract, they can't do that anymore. Also, they're introducing rent controls, which will further limit the supply into the market, which will be very, very bad for tenants. OK,
well, thanks for clarifying as far as the shares are concerned. But how can it not be a good thing for the responsibilities of landlords to become more defined?
That's not a bad thing. And we've always said, and the Leader of the Opposition, Kevin Hollinrake, said, that we are supportive of more rights for tenants. When you put more regulations in, though, don't put regulations in that are going to make life worse for tenants. And you can have all the regulations in the world around renting a house, but if there's no houses to rent, then what good is that? And that's the problem. What will happen, as has happened in Scotland, there's been a 10% reduction in the supply into the private rented sector in Scotland since those new measures were brought in. And now they're doing the same in England. It's completely wrong. It'll be followed by rent controls, which will deter landlords from investing in the marketplace, investing in more properties that people want to rent. That cannot be good.
Where are you on no-fault evictions?
Well, as I say, it's our view that, of course, most landlords don't want their tenant to leave because they want the rent. But if a landlord owns a property and needs it back and it's within their contractual obligations, or the tenant's contractual obligations to leave that property at the end of a term, then a landlord should be able to serve notice on a tenant.
It was Theresa May, I think, some 6 years ago, perhaps even longer, when she said, you know what, we don't want these no-fault evictions. She's going to ban them. We also heard previous housing secretaries talking about that as well. And yet here we are 6 years later, and they're still in place.
Well, it's fair to say that the Leader of the Opposition, Kevin Hollinrake, has a different view on that, because if you stop a landlord from saying to a tenant, particularly a tenant that's not paying their rent or damaging a property or guilty of antisocial behaviour, from evicting that tenant, that cannot be a good thing. It'll be many landlords, particularly landlords who own a few properties, or somebody who wants to rent their property because they're moving to different parts of the country or a different part of the world. If you say to those landlords, you cannot get your property back in those circumstances, or it'll take 9 months to get that tenant out at a point where they're not paying the rent, then the landlords will be less willing to rent their property, which won't be good for those tenants. That's the natural consequence of saying to a landlord they can't evict a tenant in those circumstances.
So, just to clarify, you are in favour of no-fault evictions?
I'm in favour of a landlord being able to set a term for a tenancy, and at the end of that tenancy, give notice to that tenant to leave.
But you can see how that might be abused.
Well, generally, it's not abused.
No, 80-odd%.
Well, I say you can put all the controls in place you want for a tenant, and the right controls, decent home standard, things like that, I'm totally in favour of. But if all the controls in the world, if a tenant cannot find a property to rent, then what good is that? And when in my early days, I was a estate agent in my background, 30 years in business before politics. Back in the mid-80s, when you went to rent a house in York, where I first started up, there was no choice. Your choice was probably from a couple of dark, dingy terraced houses because no landlords would invest in the marketplace. Today, you've got 4-5 million properties available in the UK to rent. There's a huge amount of supply, and that's provided by landlords who are incentivised to invest because they've got control over the letting of that property. You take away control, landlords won't invest, it'll reduce supply, which is not good for tenants and not good for the economy.
Are you confident that this government is going to be able to build as many homes as it's promised during its first tenure?
No, it won't build 1.5 million homes. I wish it could, and we wish it well, because we need to build more homes. And during our tenure, in the last 5 years, we built record numbers of houses, a 50-year record in terms of the number of houses over the last decade before we left office. But 1.5 million is a very big step up. And there's many things the government is planning to do which are good, but it'll take a while to put those measures in place. So you won't get the immediate uplift from that if they get these measures right in the first place. At the same time as wanting more houses being delivered, they're reorganising local government right across the country. Every council, every two-tier council in the country is being abolished. So all those people who work for those councils, including the planning officers, will have to reapply for their jobs. It's not a recipe for acceleration in planning consents, which are fundamental to what's happening in terms of the housing market. So I'm sure they'll miss those targets, but we want them to succeed because that's good in terms of people's choice to be able to get on the housing ladder and be able to rent a house that they want to rent.
Are you pleased to see a Keir Starmer in Kyiv this morning?
Yes, about time. I mean, 6 months, and he's not been there yet. But there's this 100-year partnership.
He would say he's too busy fixing the mess that you left behind.
Well, he would say that, wouldn't he? But the reality is, as I say, we're the fastest growing economy in the G7. Now we're the slowest, and that's all because of the crisis made in Downing Street. But yeah, listen, I welcome Keir Starmer going to Ukraine. We started this 100-year partnership, which is both an economic and a security partnership to make sure what has happened in Ukraine can't happen again. We very much hope there'll be a settlement to what happens in Ukraine and that terrible war will end. But and that's got to be because of the support of the UK and the US and the rest of the Western world. So we, of course, support Ukraine and will continue to do so until this conflict ends.
And how do you feel about the new president taking office on Monday in the US?
Well, I think I'm very supportive of America making its choices in terms of who he elects as the president. And we've got
with all sorts of tariffs, though, isn't he?
Well, it's very important that we make the right decisions in terms of we should look to the West. We should look to the US as being the most important trading partner, our biggest trading partner, biggest single trading nation. I'm very worried that what the government's currently doing is looking east, looking at China.
Can't they look both ways?
Well, I think it's very difficult to do that with President Trump's position. And so the US is our biggest trading partner, yet you've seen Keir Starmer, you've seen David Lammy, you've seen Rachel Reeves kind of going cap in hand to China in terms of trying to bridge that relationship with there. I think the most important relationship.
You guys didn't work on it, did you, when you were in power?
Well, but there are concerns around China. There are concerns about security. There are also real concerns about how it rigs the game in terms of its trading relationship. It subsidised businesses.
You said Trump's just about to rig the game.
Property. Well, I don't think he'll rig the game with us if we have the right trading relationship.
He puts tariffs in place,
the right approach. Well, let's see if they do. But certainly having that kind of very close relationship with China is not likely to make President Trump less likely to impose
So you think we should ignore them?
In China? Yeah. I think we treat them with real caution, I think, is what we should do. We've got to make sure that UK businesses work on a fair and level playing field. That's not always the case with China. But it is the case, I think, if we can strike a trade deal with the US. And I think we can do that if we make the right approaches. But I think running off to China, cap in hand, after with a very small deal in terms of some trade with China,
it's not a great deal.
Rachel Reeves has come back trumpeting. I think it's quite embarrassing.
It's about 600 million quid. It's not a lot of money.
It's not great.
It's good to see you. Thanks very much.